Hi, welcome to Salon London. I'm not Helen Bagnall, as you can see, I'm Nikki Hodgson. And tonight we're going to be talking about a truly amazing book called The Pink Line by an author called Mark Gevisser. This is the book. I'm going to show you it first. Here we go. You'll be able to buy it afterwards, so I'll tell you all the details about that. But it really is a groundbreaking work, really about the scope of LGBT rights and relations around the world. It took Mark 12 years to write, and it's just a phenomenal piece of work. So without any further ado, I'm going to say, Mark, hi, and thank you for joining us. And let's talk about your book. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, before we get going with the chat, what terms are we going to use tonight? Are we going to say LGBT, LGBT plus, queer? What language are we going to use and why?
Nikki, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Salon. This is the first stop on my virtual book tour to talk about and to engage with readers about the Pink Line. So I'm thrilled to be here. I use the subtitle of my book is The World's Queer Frontier.
Okay.
So I like to use the word queer because I like the double valence of it. It is, of course, a word that was pejoratively used against homosexuals, that has been reclaimed by many people and reappropriated by many people. But it also means skewed, askance, from an angle, to look at things from a queer perspective, which is kind of the way I look at things. So that's why I like the word. It's also, frankly, very convenient, rather than having to go LGBTQA and then think about, do I put the P in? Don't I put the P in? What does the P even mean?
Sure.
It's a very good sort of grab bag. The downside of that is that if everybody is queer, then nobody is. So I try and sort of keep the balance right about that. I know that queer is a somewhat difficult word in the United Kingdom. I'm South African, because of the history of the way that word's been used in the UK.
Yeah. Well, bearing that in mind, I'm just talking to the audience. We're going to use queer because that's Mark's term for the book. And if you've got a problem, you can message me afterwards about it. But that's the explanation for why choosing that word tonight. We'll also be using LGBT plus and other terms throughout because sometimes it's more relevant, but there we go. So, Mark, tell us, what is the Pink Line?
So the Pink Line is a concept that sort of came to me as I was thinking about this explosive new conversation that has really changed the way people think about sexual orientation and gender identity in the 21st century. The conversation that talks about these issues for the first time, not just in the West, but all over the world. And that has established a kind of new human rights frontier, which is what I call the Pink Line. And perhaps the best way of describing it this week is to look at the election that's just taken place in Poland, where the winner, the incumbent, Andrzej Duda, won by a tiny majority, in part by railing against what he called LGBT ideology. His party, the Law and Justice Party, was going to save Poland from this pernicious ideology being projected onto it by the West, by Europe, and was going to set up borders against this ideology to protect the Polish nation and the Polish family. So in a way, Duda was painting a pink line across Poland as a way of defending his people. Now, on the other side of that pink line, he placed his opponent, Rafał Trzaskowski, who is the urbane mayor of Warsaw and who, if not a passionate supporter of LGBT rights, just by virtue of being the mayor of Warsaw, is supportive of LGBT people and LGBT rights. And the Poles who voted for Trzaskowski, many of them, because of the way Trzaskowski was positioned by Duda, would have been voting for a man who they believed was tolerant, who shared the same values as are shared in other parts of Europe, and who was a sign of modernity, who was a sign of a sort of modernity that the Poles who voted for him wanted to embrace and wanted to be part of. So they too were painting a pink line and putting themselves on the other side of the pink line. It's a new us and them barrier. It's a new culture wars frontier that I see play out in different ways all over the world. And and that I've tracked in this book.
Yeah, and you do it so beautifully as well. And you really highlight the complexities of it, which we're going to get into now. So you start the book with the story of Aunty, who's a refugee from Malawi and is chased out of the country for being herself, basically, and marrying her partner, Benson. Can you tell us something about this story? Because it's a really complex tale of identity and non-acceptance and immigration. So, yeah, can you just tell us a bit about why you started with this story?
Yeah, so the very first lines of my book are gaze, engage. And this was the headline of a newspaper in the Central African country of Malawi when the newspaper descended on an engagement ceremony between two men, one of whom is actually a transgender woman, but the newspaper saw two men. And these two men, one of whom is named Tiwonga Chimbalanga, had held a public engagement ceremony in their home country. And as a result, they became this sort of cause célèbre, but also because homosexuality is illegal in Malawi, the police and the Justice Department saw this newspaper, descended on them, arrested them, and they were charged with carnal knowledge against the order of nature. And in a very sensational trial, were sentenced to 14 years hard labor in prison, just for having held this engagement ceremony. This became a sort of international event because the global LGBT community was outraged about this. Madonna, who has adopted Malawian babies, set up a petition to have them released. Ban Ki-moon, who was then the Secretary General of the United Nations, actually went on a mercy mission to talk to the Malawian president to get them pardoned. And as a result, they were pardoned. But after they were pardoned, Tiwonga, who's the transgender woman who goes as Aunty, was just not safe in Malawi anymore. So with the help of Amnesty International, she received political asylum in South Africa on the basis of her transgender identity. So the South African government, because South Africa is on, theoretically, the other side of the pink line to Malawi, we have a constitution that outlaws discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. We are apparently one of the freer places in the world, and I say apparently because it's complicated. South Africa agreed to grant her asylum. She was brought to South Africa, sort of airlifted to South Africa by Amnesty International. And I pick up the story in South Africa where I meet her, just 20 kilometers from where I live, in a township on the Cape Flats in Cape Town. And I got very close to her, and I looked at how complex and difficult her life was in South Africa, in this place where she was meant to be free, that was meant to be some sort of paradise for her. The complexity of her life here, once she landed, said something to me about what happens when people's lives get caught up in these pink line politics. It's also really interesting to me how at different points of this journey, she had different identities, from being a woman to being gay. The newspapers call her gay. Once she arrived in South Africa, she took on this transgender identity because transgender is what people like her are called here. All at the same time, she sees herself as a woman. And I think what's very important to me about the story of Tiwonga and Aunty, and one of the reasons why I begin it, is because there's this idea that in Africa, that African societies are homophobic and transphobic, and life is very difficult. And certainly Auntie's story shows that in some ways. But what was interesting about what happened to her is that she took a decision to be public in a way that nobody had been before. And as a result, there were consequences in her home country of Malawi. And I think that's one of the big shifts that's happened in the world in the last decade, is that people like Aunty, downloading globalized ideas of freedom, of personal autonomy, of political identity, are expressing these ideas in their home, in their local environments for the first time. And this is inevitably creating cultural conflict. It's inevitably getting some backlash against it. So even though homosexuality was never prosecuted as a crime in Malawi before Aunty got publicly engaged, suddenly it was something to be seen and to be condemned as a contamination of the West.
So she becomes a symbol, really, more than a person to certain people who are viewing it, and almost a political pawn at one point. Because am I right in saying that
Yes, that's correct.
there's a kind of discussion about aid money being dependent on her release?
Well, I mean, this is one of the this is a very important point, which is the way these politics get activated. So there are countries in the world which provide development aid, such as the United Kingdom or the Netherlands or the United States, who began to write in to their development aid protocols that they were going to suspend aid to countries who violated human rights. And this is what happened to Malawi at the time that Tiwonga Chimbalanga and her lover, Stephen Monjeza, were arrested and thrown in jail. And it had a very complex result because it also caused a backlash against gay people in Malawi, who were now being seen as the reason why the country wasn't getting aid. It so happened that at the time the country was going through an economic crisis. So an act that was sort of meant to help queer people in Malawi had unintended consequences because of the way the West was trying to intervene. Also, by intervening in this particular way, Western countries were merely underscoring the narrative, the homophobic narrative, that homosexuality is a Western import, and that people who are gay in Africa are doing it to get paid by the West, that it's a sort of money-making enterprise. It's almost a form of sex work, is one of the myths about homosexuality in Africa.
Okay, yeah. The thing that strikes me actually, from the beginning, Mark, about the book, is that there's a feeling amongst, lots of people in the world in different countries that sometimes if the West goes into a country like Malawi and tries to tell them what they should be doing around people's LGBT plus rights, that's seen as and felt as a kind of neocolonialism by the country. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, that is certainly what the Malawian president would have said at the time. I mean, it's a very commonly held assumption. It's complicated, and it depends on the way you go into a country and what you say, because it may well be a form of neocolonialism to suspend aid to Malawi if Malawi doesn't release Tiwonga Chimbalanga, but that whole discourse sort of ignores and denies the fact that there are Malawian queer people, that the person who stood up and got counted was a Malawian transgender woman called Tiwonga Chimbalanga, and nobody told her to do it. I mean, the fake news in Malawi was that she was paid by I don't know who, George Soros, by the American government to hold this engagement ceremony. She didn't. It was entirely her own idea. She did it because she felt free enough to do it, because she felt some form of personal autonomy. It came from inside, not from outside. And this argument about neocolonialism often ignores that reality, which is that queer people in the countries that are involved in this sort of conflict, whether it's Russia and the Ukraine or Egypt and Malawi, or the Philippines, are from that country, and it is part of their identity as Africans or as Russians. It's not something external that's been grafted onto them that they are queer, or gay, or transgender.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. So let's move to Egypt, actually, because in Egypt, you meet a lesbian couple called Amira and Mahar, and Amira runs a women's cafe in Cairo. And this story is set just after the Arab Spring has happened, and you write about how queer people are starting to take more risks with their freedoms and wanting to kind of be together and, be in public. But also there's a very strong strand of homophobia in the country. There's lots of government crackdown on gay male dating apps and men out and about on the streets. And the women, to some extent, sort of slip under the radar for a time until they don't. And then eventually they get into trouble with the authorities too. So what is that story there? What sort of happens to them?
Well, the story of Maha Namira and the Arab Spring is told through that chapter is really very poignant because what actually happened is that many Egyptians came out as queer for the first time on Tahrir Square, and there was a really big and vibrant scene. And it was described to me in a beautiful way by one of the people I met in Egypt as we are able to be ourselves on the street for the first time, with our politics, with our sexual identity, with our gender identity, whatever. And in this kind of in this foment and in this rush of being able to be themselves for the first time, a lot of people came out, and Amira and Maha, the couple I write about, set up a sidewalk shisha cafe, which is a very kind of male thing to do, in the middle of downtown Cairo. And this became the hangout place for queer Cairo, their cafe. And it was quite beautiful to observe it and to observe the way, despite the sort of homophobia that was sometimes thrown at them and the battles they had with some of the thugs of the neighborhood, they were claiming their space, they were claiming the street. And what happened in Egypt is what's happened in many places, is when there was the CCQ coup and the clampdown, one of the ways that the military reasserted itself after this sort of chaotic Arab Spring, one of the ways it showed that it was now the party of law and order and it was going to bring order back to this Egypt that had gone off the rails, was by drawing a pink line, by clamping down on gay people, by clamping down on transgender people, by showing Egyptians that it was in control again, by taking action against this kind of dodgy or unpopular community. So the people such as Maha and Amira, who had this extraordinary freedom, suddenly found themselves having to go underground again, or into exile, as Maha did. Maha now lives; she's a refugee now in the Netherlands. And to me, it's a very poignant story and a very emblematic story of the kind of dynamics on the Pink Line, and the way the 21st century, when it comes to talking about LGBTQ rights, can't be seen as some sort of inexorable journey towards freedom, from the perspective of a Western liberal democracy, but is rather something of a pendulum that swings, because people claim space, and then there's backlash, and then they claim space, and then there's backlash. It's a complex and contradictory motion.
Yeah, and I think something else which is poignant about the story is that they end up breaking up, don't they, as a couple, because of everything they've been through. And I think even Maha in Amsterdam is just sort of saying, I don't even feel free or comfortable here. They look at me in a different way. They don't treat me fairly. This isn't the liberty that I thought I was going to get. Yeah.
There's a slogan that was actually used to help teenagers in the United States as part of a campaign, and the campaign is "It Gets Better." And there's this idea that it gets better, and in a way, if you're a gay teen who's really struggling with your identity, or a trans teen who's really struggling with your identity, and you see videos of adults saying, "Don't worry, it's going to get better. You're going to be okay." I mean, it's hugely encouraging. And in my research, from countries as widespread as Russia and Egypt and the United States, I've seen how that kind of that approach has really helped young people. I think it's really valuable. I guess with my stories, and I tell 10 different stories from 10 different countries through this book, I really wanted it to get better in every single one of the stories. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it doesn't because of politics, the politics of Egypt. Sometimes couples just break up, as they do in the world. I mean, I follow these people for 6 or 7 years, and a couple might tell me when I first meet them that they're planning their dream wedding in Cyprus, but then they split up. Maybe one of them was unfaithful. Maybe they had to go underground and into exile. I think, as with all people, there's there's a sort of fantasy of what life will be, and then there's the reality of what happens. And in the people I follow, I look at the way that reality is impacted upon by politics.
And there's a feeling that lots of what they go through is heightened. So the troubles that anybody would have with a relationship, they're kind of times 10 in some of the situations when they're dealing with being split apart and having to move countries and dealing with the law and all these kinds of things, isn't there?
Sure, of course.
Yeah. So I wanted to say something you really convey beautifully in the book is that the debate about LGBT plus rights and particularly trans rights comes at a huge human cost, and it's the people involved, it's their stories and their situations and them as humans that, suffer as a result of the political arguments. And, you talk in the book, or you explore in the book, that for some of the trans people, it's everything from either losing access to their children to feeling completely ostracized from either the society they're in or everybody they know, to them becoming weaponized by the state. And I think one of the best and most moving chapters in the book is the one about the younger trans people that you write. Why was it important to you to what was it important to you to convey when you were writing this section? Because it's a very difficult chapter in some ways.
Well, this is the chapter that I set in the United States. And I suppose as I was thinking about the pink line and what the pink line means in different countries and cultures, it became really clear to me that in the West, and particularly in the Anglo-West, the new pink line was around transgender rights, and specifically around early transition, around young people transitioning. Gay marriage is the new normal. Pete Buttigieg was nearly the presidential candidate. We nearly had Chad as the first husband of the United States. Homosexuality has really been normalized in the United States. And so the culture wars has found new territory. The religious right, I argue, has needed to find a new boogeyman, a new enemy, and at the same time, stepping up the steps that were laid by the gay rights movement. Transgender people are coming out. So you had that incredible Time magazine cover. I don't know how many of the people listening to this remember it, with fabulous Laverne Cox on the cover and the title, "The Transgender Tipping Point." Suddenly, transgender people were visible for the first time as never before. At the same time that the religious right was looking for new battles. And the way the religious right found these new battles was in the rights of transgender kids to use bathrooms congruent to their felt genders. And the politics and the medicine of the United States had moved to the point where this was becoming increasingly normal. In fact, Barack Obama's administration issued a directive that kids should be able to do this, that it was the law that kids should be able to do this. And the religious right grabbed on this and saw it as an assault on the religious freedom of their children. I mean, bizarrely, to have to use the same bathrooms. And also as a new threat to society and as a threat to God's divine plan, because transgender people, according to this religious ideology, are tampering with God's design. Now, into this political maelstrom is a generation of very brave young people who are coming out as trans, often with the help of their parents or with professionals. And there's a very, very, very difficult debate as to whether they should be encouraged to transition, whether there should be attempts rather to correct them, or whether they should be put in some kind of holding zone until they're adults so they can make their own decision. Rather than adjudicating in these debates, which I don't feel I'm qualified to do, I decided what I would do is I would get to know some of these kids. And I was introduced to a really wonderful youth group called Riot Youth in the town of Ann Arbor, which is a university town in Michigan. And I met a bunch of the kids there, and I followed them for the last 7 years as they've sort of matured into adulthood. And they cover the waterfront. One of them is now non-binary and uses the they pronouns. Another one transitioned to masculinity very happily and very successfully, and is now a prominent activist. A third one transitioned to masculinity and then decided she'd made the wrong decision, so detransitioned, and is now a woman again, but with a very deep voice because she took testosterone for a little while. And it's fascinating to talk to her about the choices she made and what caused her to make those choices and what the consequences of them are. And I suppose what I feel about these kids who are now young adults is they are, some people sort of idealize them as pioneers, and other people say that they are guinea pigs in a terrible experiment. And what I see in them are a generation of extraordinary young people who are moving the culture into uncharted territory, are changing the way we think about gender, the way we think about bodies, the way we think about the binary in the West, in ways that are very challenging and I think very interesting. And while there are obviously going to be some people who suffer along the way, there's something happening that I think this generation of young people are getting us to see.
Yeah, I think that really comes across just so well in the book, so well in the chapter. And also, you know, how strongly they feel about their identities, you know, and very early on, most of them have very distinct feelings about who they are and how they want to present and who they want to be. And they advocate for themselves, don't they, in many situations?
Well, one of the things that one of the adults who works with them said to me is that that this transgender growth has happened at a time when there's been some really important shifts in culture, and one of the important shifts in culture is that children are listened to. Certainly in American culture, children are listened to. And if you're going to ask a child who they are and how they feel, you have to be prepared to listen to the answer and take it on and deal with it. So children should be seen and not heard no longer applies in Anglo culture and in Anglo-American culture. And if you're going to listen to children, you have to hear what they say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with them or do everything they tell you to, but you certainly have to listen. And that's happening in American culture and in British culture.
Yeah. I think the other thing that is really brilliant about the book, Mark, is that you show the lives that trans people have lived well before we've been having this very public and current debate about trans rights. So you go to communities where, in India and Bangladesh, where there's Hijra, where there's a Koti, I think they're called.
Koti is the people
yeah.
Right, yeah.
And you explore how these people have always been around and lived in their communities, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not, but that there's always been a place for them, but not always necessarily legal rights, and that's the kind of key difference that we're seeing now. But why is it, do you think, that discussing the legal rights is becoming so inflammatory, in your opinion, just at the moment?
Well, I think it's because where people are claiming legal rights or political rights, it's often in societies that are anti-democratic or that have sort of limited notions of what democracy means. And where it's always okay, where it's been always okay to kind of do your stuff as long as you do it on the down low and abide by the sort of patriarchal norms. So where if you want to have a guy, if you're a guy and you want to have a guy, or you're a girl and you want to have a girl, that's fine, but get married, have children, let the bloodline sort of flow, and don't rock the boat. And now there's a generation of young people who are saying, no, I don't want to marry a man and have children in that way. I want to live with another woman, and I'm going to claim the right to do that. And if you're not going to give me that right, I'm going to fight for that right, which means I'm going to enter public space. And I'm going to fight for that right in public space in societies like Uganda or Russia, where civil society is not only frowned upon but suppressed. So one of the ways that the state shows that it's not going to tolerate any of these sort of calls from civil society is by clamping down on this unpopular minority. It's also really interesting. You mentioned hijras in India. Now there are many cultures all over the world, but particularly in South Asia and in West Africa, where there have always been third gender people, always. And where there's always been a kind of a gender spectrum rather than the kind of gender binary we know in the West. Sometimes in the West, we sort of idealize that gender spectrum. And I'd caution against that, because hijras might have their place in Indian society. It might, in some mythical past, have been a very lofty place. But right now, it's a pretty lowly place. Hijras are beggars and sex workers. They are sort of expelled from their home communities. They have to form parallel societies. There are hundreds of thousands of them. Every Indian knows a hijra. But they have a very circumscribed place. Now, along comes a global human rights movement and says, you don't need to have this circumscribed space. Stop thinking yourselves as hijras who have this kind of cultural space or this cultural valence, and begin thinking of yourself as transgender people, a political identity, the identity of a political minority that connects in with other political minorities who call themselves transgender all over the world. And now you can claim a whole lot of rights, which is what Indian transgender people hijras have been doing as transgender people. This disrupts society in so many ways, because hijras themselves are organized into very feudal, very oppressive families. Now, if a young hijra or transgender woman is going to claim her rights in the state, she might also start to claim her rights in the family and say to her hijra mother, her guru, you may no longer oppress me in this way. I am a free person. I am not your slave. So age-old systems and accommodations are disrupted when people start claiming their rights in this way. And there is inevitably some kind of cultural foment around it.
Yeah.
So in India, I look at in India, what I do, the Indian chapter is one of my favorite chapters. It's my last chapter. I look at an extraordinary community of kotis, as they call themselves, women's hearts in men's bodies, who have decided, because they are young and because some of them have smartphones and are connected to the bigger world, also through the AIDS movement, they have decided that they are not going to accept the choices that have always been put to people like them. They're not going to either put on what they call pant shirts and grow moustaches and become straight men, or leave their families and become hijras. They want to stay in their home community, which is a fishing village in the south of India, and be who they are, be able to be who they are, but remain within their families. And I track the way they do that, and with limited success, but with a lot of courage and agency through the establishment of a temple in their village. Because what they figure out very cleverly is that there's a particular deity that requires men to dress in saris to worship her. So they now channel this deity. She's a very powerful deity. She's an iteration of Kali. They channel this deity for the other people in their community. And this is, in fact, something that kotis and hijras do throughout India.
Yeah, it's a really brilliant chapter, actually. I think I think what really comes across is that dedication to wanting to have family life, to wanting to have the things that other people take for granted. Can we move on and talk about Israel, actually? Because you tell us there about a really intricate love story between Fadi and Nadav. One's Israeli, one's Palestinian. And there's something really interesting that comes up, which is about how the power relations between Israel and Palestine end up playing out in the relationship to some extent. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, Israel and Palestine were interesting to me because I was fascinated in the way there the sort of the pink line is tracked onto the or traced over the green line, which is the line that separates what's being called Palestine from Israel. And Israel has made a point of granting rights to its queer citizens, of allowing freedom to LGBT plus people in Israel in a way that's been called pinkwashing, in that Israel pinkwashes its human rights record against Palestinians by granting rights to queer people. And through this, Israel can claim that it's a truly multicultural society, that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. And this gives queer people a particular status, you can imagine, in Palestine, because of the way they're used against Palestine, where there's a different culture, a more covert culture around sexuality. And what was fascinating to me about Fadi, who's the main character in that chapter, he is a really wonderful nurse who works in a hospital in Tel Aviv. He comes from a Palestinian family in Israel, so he has Israeli citizenship. What was fascinating about him was the way he articulated the kind of cognitive dissonance of being validated as gay by Israel, but denigrated as Palestinian, and how he tried to hold those two together. Because Israel allows him to be openly gay in a way he couldn't be on the other side of the Green Line in the West Bank, but at a cost. So I tell the story about how, coincidentally, long before they met, Fadi and Nadav, his boyfriend, both of whom were sort of in their teens, went to the same Pride march in Tel Aviv. And Tel Aviv Pride is huge. Tel Aviv is one of the gayest cities on the planet. And for Nadav, who came from a small Israeli town and a somewhat conservative family, like Tel Aviv Pride was, oh my God, this is my future. These are my people. Get me to Tel Aviv. I know who I am. This is where I belong. And for Fadi, it was a lot more complicated because he had this intense longing. He wished he could exhibit the freedom that he was seeing by these other people at the Pride March. But he knew that he couldn't for two reasons. Firstly, because it wouldn't necessarily be tolerated by his home community. But secondly, because he didn't feel welcome as a Palestinian, as an Arab, at this Pride March, where the Israeli flag is flying overlaid with the rainbow flag in a form of nationalism, where gay rights has become almost a Zionist statement against Arabs.
Yeah, I've been to Tel Aviv Pride, and it is it's inescapable. You can't get away from the kind of the flags and the military are there, and it's a national holiday, isn't it? It's kind of that's how it's taken, which is obviously quite in contrast to lots of the countries that you talk about and write about in the book, where it's kind of you can win a presidential election by saying you're not going to be that kind of nation. But I think for example, in Brazil, you talk about Bolsonaro saying something absolutely awful, that he'd rather his child be in a car crash than be gay, or so. It's just awful, isn't it?
Right. But what he's doing, you see, once more, I mean, is Bolsonaro really homophobic? Or is he making a statement for political effect? I don't know. I mean, whether he's really homophobic or not, the statement has a particular political effect. And that political effect is to say to Brazilians, the people who I'm replacing, Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, are corrupt and decadent. And the way we can see that they're corrupt and decadent is the rights they gave to these queers and these perverts. And I'm going to show you I'm different. I'm going to show you that I'm a law and order guy by making these tough statements against the people who Lula and Dilma and their corrupt cronies liberated. So there again, you see queer people being weaponized. And the effects in Brazil have been really dire. An NGO that tracks violence against LGBT people and murders and suicides of LGBT people tracked the way the number went up sort of exponentially once this kind of homophobic discourse by Bolsonaro and other opponents of Dilma were publicly aired.
Yeah, it's terrible. So before I ask Mark his last question, I'm just going to say that we are going to open up for comments after this. So if you've got a question for Mark, or you've got a question about the book or anything that we've talked about, then type it in the box and we will endeavour to answer it. So Mark, I just wanted to ask you, when we talked about the book before, you said that you were aware that you had sometimes been a vector in some of the lives of these people that you've written about. Can you tell us what you mean by that? Because obviously you've had an absolutely unique position in what you've witnessed and what you've, recounted.
Nikki, I write about how this new debate and this pink line has been plotted as a consequence of globalization, as a consequence of the digital revolution, as a consequence of the way people and ideas have traveled in the last couple of decades as never before. And that's self-evident. But if these ideas are a consequence of globalization, I have to sort of understand myself as I go to these countries, as I go to Egypt or Uganda or Russia, with my notebook in hand, an openly gay man writing about queer stuff as one of the vectors, if only because that's how other people see me. So I explore it, for example, in the story I tell of an extraordinary young man called Michael, who is a Ugandan refugee who now lives in Canada, who I met when he was a teenager and who had fled the most brutal home life and had been subject to sort of violation and torture by somebody he met on Facebook who was offering to help him, but who then extorted him, kind of exploiting the fact that he was gay and vulnerable. And my heart went out to him. I mean, and I have to say, my heart went out to him as a gay man, because I looked at this teenager and I remembered how difficult it was for me to come out as a teenager, with resources, with a loving and accepting family. And if it was difficult for me, my Lord, what must it be like for him? So when there was when the hat went around the community to see if there was a way to get Michael into school, without thinking, I put some money into that hat. I became involved in the plan to rescue Michael, to help him. Well, I thought to help him, but others might see it as to rescue him. And the homophobes would see it as to contaminate him. There I was paying this kid with my Western dollars. And I had to look very closely at that. And I do in the book. I sort of, I go above my relationship with Michael to look at the dynamics and to try and understand the dynamics as a pink line dynamic. And it was and remains a complex dynamic. I write about it in the book because of where I come from and the resources I have and who Michael is and what life served to him. So that's what I mean about understanding myself as a vector. It's sort of just being somewhat self-conscious of who I am as I go blundering into, or hopefully not blundering, but as I enter the spaces that these people live in, and try and understand their world.
Well, I think you have a lot of insight about it, so I think it's done really well. But it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge, and I say that as someone who has travelled and written about some of the similar issues that you have as a journalist, as an LGBT journalist as well. It's hard not to get drawn in if you're empathic and you're paying attention. So I'm going to take it over to some questions now. So I'm going to just quickly swap my screen because this is what I have to do. And here we go. So let's have a look at what we've got here. First of all, actually, I've got a question from Todd, Mark, and Todd wants to know, why write this book now?
Todd, well, I started researching this book like nearly a decade ago, but why write it now? Because I think these are politics that define us geopolitically now in a way that they haven't before. Because I think it is a frontier, and it's a frontier we don't understand, a human rights frontier we don't understand as clearly as we could and we should. And because, as I think Nikki said very eloquently, as there are these debates, whether it is by Polish presidential candidates or people arguing about whether transgender people should have rights, I think it's really important to remember and to note, to hear the people who these debates affect, the people who actually live on the front line, on the pink line. And I wanted the book to give them voice.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question from Helen, and she says, thank you for the book, and she's really glad to see you. And can we talk a little bit about the UK, specifically with transgender rights becoming so polarising? How can we best be a trans ally?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have an easy answer for that, Helen. Beyond saying what I just said, which is to listen to and to understand, if you're not trans yourself and I'm not trans, what it means to be trans, and to, rather than to see trans people in some abstract way as proponents of an ideology that are affecting the majority in a negative way, to understand them as full and legitimate parts of our society, and as extensions of ourselves rather than something different to ourselves and other than ourselves. I think this is maybe a sideways way of answering your question, Helen. But for me, the great gift of doing this work was the way it opened up for me an understanding of gender as a spectrum rather than as something binary. It opened up an understanding for me of how complex and multivalent gender was. So to see transgender people as providing us with that insight and that gift rather than as a threat is a good place to start.
Okay, we've got another question actually about trans rights too, but this is a bit of a different angle. Gina has said, feminist neuroscientists have recently been accused of providing ammunition for TERFs. Do you think biological research, especially neuroscience, could contribute to an understanding of transgender issues, or would it be better if they stayed out of the argument?
I'm not hugely qualified to answer that, except to say that it's interesting to me as somebody who's observed this space, the way biological explanations are given for transgender identity today, similarly to the way in a previous generation they were given to gay identity. So the debate in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a lot of talk about a gay gene, and that was really important to an earlier generation of gay activists because they were able to say, no, but I was born this way. Nobody made me this way. It wasn't my mother, it wasn't the culture, it's in my genes. And there's similar research today, neurological research, but also a research about what happens sort of in the intrauterine development of an embryo, trying to pin down the biological roots of a transgender identity. And my answer to that is like, whatever. It doesn't matter whether I am gay because of a gay gene or because nurture in some way or another made me gay. Similarly, I don't think it should matter whether there is a neurological basis to being trans or an intrauterine basis to being trans. If one accepts the principle of self-determination, which is that I have the right to say who I am and to live freely as who I am, so long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of others. If I say I'm trans, I'm trans. Why does there need to be some kind of biological or neurological sort of forensic investigation? And the dangers of such investigations is, of course, also that they can be used to kind of, if there's a gay gene, you can eliminate the gay gene if you don't want a gay child. If there's an intrauterine condition that creates transgenderism, well, maybe you can abort the baby before it comes out as transgender. It's a sort of dangerous eugenic slope to go down. I'm not quite sure whether that answers the question, but
well, thanks for that, Mark. Okay, another question from Lynn now. In many places in the world, lesbians do seem to be considered less offensive, in inverted commas, to homophobes. Is it only a matter of time before that changes?
that's a fascinating question. And I mean, if you think about it, the tomboy is often accepted in a way the sissy boy isn't. You know, there's a place in society for masculine women, and I'm not saying lesbians are necessarily masculine women, that there isn't for the effeminate man. And similarly, transgender men have a much easier time integrating than transgender women. I don't know if it's a matter of time. I think it's actually a function of patriarchal society, that women who take on some of the traits of masculinity, and those traits might include having a girlfriend, or being an athlete, or doing a male job, are seen as sort of stepping up a level, whereas men who take on the traits of femininity are seen as stepping down a level. Now, that's by no means a universal truth. In my home country, South Africa, there has been a terrible epidemic of violent crime against butch lesbians in South Africa's working class townships because of the way these women have claimed space for the first time as a result of the constitutional changes in South Africa, the political changes in South Africa. They're seen by some men to be immensely threatening. They're accused of stealing these men's girlfriends, of stealing these men's jobs. And there's been this phenomenon of what's called corrective rape, of these women being raped and even murdered in alarming numbers.
Yeah, and you do talk about that in the book, and you know that is horrific, truly horrific. Something I wanted to ask, actually, another question I wanted to ask you is, again, I mean, it touches on what Helen asks, you know, given that you write these stories of struggle, and they really are about struggle, and how you said at the beginning, you know, people live their lives and they kind of work towards a place of freedom or a point at which they think it gets better, and then maybe it doesn't get better, or it doesn't get easier, or it gets better in some ways and maybe not the ways they were expecting. What can we do to make the world a better place for queer people?
Um,
The $1 million
Wow.
question.
I don't know, respect, listen, lobby, um, understand. I think a key thing to understand, and really I hope that my book helps how this kind of one-size fits all LGBTQI identity. You know, it's very easy to wrap a rainbow flag around everybody who calls themselves gay or lesbian or trans all over the world and say they're all the same. They're not, because they all have very different cultural identities as well that connect them to who they are. And I think it's critical to understand that. To understand, for example, that in some societies, visibility means different things to what it might mean in the United Kingdom in 2020. And that safety has to be kind of balanced with visibility. That being sort of out and proud is really not an option and shouldn't be expected of people in the way one can be out and proud in South London.
Yeah, I remember going to Japan actually a few years ago to report on some rival prides that were taking place in Tokyo. And what struck me was that on one of them, many of the Japanese participants were wearing kabuki masks to parade. So they were visible, but they were not visible. And that was their way of kind of keeping themselves safe, but you know, still expressing themselves. And it was a very visceral thing to see. Really, you know, it stayed with me over the years about how lucky I was and how much freedom I've always had to be able to be myself in my bi identity. So yeah, I just wanted to end, Mark, actually by saying I think you've got an article coming out, haven't you, in The Guardian in the next couple of days?
Yes, I do. That's right.
I wondered if you wanted to just tell us a little bit about what that's about.
Well, it's really about what I started this conversation with, which is understanding the way that the Polish election has drawn the pink line yet again. But I understand it in the context of a new global movement, right-wing movement against what's called gender ideology. This idea that that's taken hold. It began in the Catholic Church, but it's now become a sort of a clearinghouse for conservative Christian and Muslim organizations the world over. This idea that we're not fighting a lifestyle, we're not fighting people demanding their rights alone. We're fighting this ideology, and an ideology that is described as being sort of at the core of the Western secular experiment. An ideology that gender is mutable and a social construct and not God-given, and not God-given the way sex is. And so whether it's men marrying men or whether it's people wanting to transition from masculinity to femininity, people are seen as being adherents to this ideology. And a counter-ideology needs to be set up against it. And I believe that is where anti-LGBT politics is going. And we're going to see more of that, of this battle against an ideology, this notion that there's some kind of doctrine or ideology that you as bi and me as gay are not just being ourselves, but that we are proponents of an ideology, is what the homophobes and the transphobes are saying now. And that was very clearly articulated in the Polish election by Duda and his campaign.
Yeah. Just one final question for you, Mark. Besides the obvious of selling loads of copies, what do you hope that the book achieves?
I really hope that it helps readers, and particularly English-speaking readers, because it begins by being published in English, just how complex and varied queer experiences globally. Really, that there is not a sort of one-size-all-rainbow wrapper to LGBTQI identity, and that very complex things happen when people download ideas that are supposedly global and try and apply them in their lives, in their families, in their churches, in their countries. And it doesn't necessarily follow the sort of set narrative of oppressed to liberation that we've imposed on it from our experiences in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a good opportunity for me to show the book once again to the audience. Here it is, The Pink Line. You know what it looks like now. It's for sale in the Salon London bookshop, so you can get it there. Please get it there, because we all know who else will get the money for it if we don't purchase it from us. And it just leaves me to say, really, thank you to Mark. Mark, you've been wonderful, so insightful, so erudite, so clear. And, you know, I wish you all the best, and I hope the book does brilliantly for you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you, Nikki, and to Salon for helping inaugurate my virtual book tour with this wonderful event.
You're welcome.
Good night.
Good night. Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming to look and listen to us tonight. Remember that Mark's book is for sale